Hey, Fellowship Kids team. Autumn here to talk to you about the lesson that we'll be teaching in our Fellowship Kids classes this coming Sunday, March 10th. Easter this year is on March 31st, and through the month of March, we in our kids' classes, through the stories that we're telling and the passages that we're looking at, are journeying with Jesus and the disciples through the events of the last week of Jesus' life before his death and resurrection toward Resurrection Sunday. And this week, our passage is Mark 14:12 through 26. Now, the Grow curriculum writers have chosen, I'm going to pull out my lesson for this Sunday, have chosen the big idea for this week of Jesus is the light in the darkness. And this corresponds to the theme that they have put over all of these lessons for the month, which is glow in the dark. Now, Jesus is the light in the darkness is a true statement in general. However, it is not present in Mark 14:12 through 26. So I'm not going to talk much about this big idea. They do also list a supplemental passage for the elementary class that is John 3:16 through 21. The idea of Jesus being the light is mentioned in that section of John 3. But the preschool lesson passage simply lists Mark 14 and doesn't mention the John 3 passage. So I'm not going to mention the aspect of Jesus being light as we look at this passage, and I will leave it to you, as always, to decide how you want to teach this passage to your particular class of students and whether or not you would like to pull a big idea that you want them to walk away with after this Sunday. So let's take a look at the passage together. In this passage in Mark 14, Jesus and his disciples are preparing for the Passover, and then it records them sharing the Passover meal. So in order to understand this passage, let's backtrack. Let's do a quick, few hundred years flyover back to when God brought Israel out of Egypt. When God brought his people Israel out of Egypt and freed them from slavery in Egypt, in that moment, the critical night in the story, he asked them to observe this specific meal. And as a part of that, he asked them to slaughter a lamb and to put its blood on the doorposts. And that was an indication that they were his covenant people. They were protected by the blood of this lamb that was sacrificed on their behalf. And then after God brought Israel out of Egypt, he established a covenant relationship with them. In Exodus 24, we read the account of God establishing this covenant with Israel, and the sign that sealed the covenant was the blood of an animal that was sprinkled over the altar to seal the covenant. And God also instructed the Israelites to remember this moment, remember the moment of their deliverance, and the way that they were to remember it was to eat the Passover meal together and recount the story of the Exodus every year together as the people of God. Now, over time, so if we fast forward from that moment, a few hundred years, over time, Israel and Judah turned away from God. And God allowed the nations around them to conquer them and carry many of them off to be slaves again, but as captives by those nations that had conquered them. And this is the period of the exile. And during this period, several prophets carry God's messages to his people Israel. Notably, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel all record and declare that when God calls Israel out of exile, so they expect God to work again on Israel's behalf in this way, in the way that he delivered them once, they expect God to call Israel out of exile again. And all three of these prophets say that God will establish a new covenant with Israel. And through all of those years, the observance of Passover endured. So now, in Mark 14, at this period of time, Israel is living under Roman occupation. So they have not experienced the calling out of exile that they had hoped and prayed and watched for. And Jesus and his disciples are observing this sacred meal together, recounting the story of God's deliverance. And in this passage, Jesus uses this moment at the Passover meal, so one of Israel's most sacred observances that had endured since the Exodus. So it was incredibly significant. He uses this moment to place himself in the center of the prophetic story. So let's backtrack one more time, not quite as far as we did the first time, but back through some of what the Gospels have told us. So Jesus called together 12 disciples, representative of the 12 tribes of Israel. Jesus said that he, in himself, fulfilled or filled full God's law. Jesus had taught the way of God's kingdom, and Jesus revealed the nature of God's kingdom through his ministry, the way he went about his ministry, and through the miracles that he performed. And now, in this moment, Jesus had made his way to Jerusalem during the holy festival season. And in the lesson that we learned about in the first week of March, Jesus went to the temple and essentially said that he was taking the place of the temple. He said, tear down this temple and I will rebuild it in 3 days. And John 3 says, but he was talking about his body. So Jesus is teaching us he is the very presence of God. That's what the temple indicated and symbolized. It was where you came to meet with God, to experience the presence of God. And he was making a new way for a new family of God to worship God in spirit and in truth. And now in this account, Jesus is reconstituting Israel's sacred remembrance of their deliverance around himself. He's placing himself into the prophetic account as the Passover lamb, as the one whose blood will say, these are my covenant people called by my name, and death has no dominion here. Furthermore, the main theological point of this passage is that Jesus, in the way he's situating himself within the prophetic account, is saying, I am the one by whose blood the new covenant is sealed. So these new covenant people who are called into relationship with me as part of my new family, they are covered by my blood, and my blood is the sign of the seal of this covenant. I said earlier that this video is not intended to tell you what to teach to your kids. It's to help us think through this passage together before we teach it to our kids. But if I were teaching this Sunday, I would take the opportunity to talk about communion. Communion is something that we observe at Fellowship Denver every week together as the people of God. And we remember, just as this passage teaches us, that Jesus' blood was shed for us, his body was actually broken for us. And by taking communion, we're also reminding ourselves that we are a part of his new covenant family and that he is our rescuer. He is the one whose blood was shed so that we can be fully a part of God's family and fully made alive.